Hello, everyone. Welcome to our fourth and final monopolistic competition market structure. This is our final market structure we've looked at. We have already looked at perfect competition, and we have looked at monopoly, and then we looked at oligopoly, and we are now finally wrapping it up and finishing with monopolistic competition. So, as the name implies, it is going to be similar to a competitive market structure, but it's also going to have some characteristics of a monopoly, which is going to be kind of intriguing. And I will say, for as we kind of get started, pay special attention to monopolistic competition. Historically, on the AP test, we've seen probably the other three more predominant as far as a testing or an FRQ question. So I've seen more FRQ questions on perfect competition, monopoly, oligopolies. That being said, probably in the last 4 years or so, I've actually seen an increase in monopolistic competition testing. I'm not sure if that's a trend that will continue, but I would just caution you to not kind of take your foot off the gas pedal yet. Make sure you understand this one. Fortunately, it's concepts we've already learned, so it's going to be actually probably a breeze to kind of get through it. So, the only other thing I would end with is that third bullet point. I want you to realize is that monopolistic competition in the real life, in the real world, this is the most common structure. Most of the things that you are going to interact with on a daily basis is going to be in some form or another a monopolistically competitive market. So as we've looked at before, we're talking about imperfect competition. So these are market structures that fall between perfect competition and a pure monopoly. So it's going to be monopolistic competition and it's going to be oligopoly. We've done this before, so I'm going to go through this quickly, but just to remind you, when you're looking at your four market structures, you have to start by asking, how many firms are there? If there's just one firm, clearly we know that that's going to be a monopoly. If there are just a few of them, think to yourself, what is that going to be? Clearly, that's going to be an oligopoly. And then if there are multiple firms, and so this is why we're talking about this today, is that if there are many firms, it could be two different type of market structures. So you have to then ask, is the type of the product identical or not? If it is differentiated, if the products that are made by these many firms are different, that's what we're talking about today, which is going to be monopolistic competition. We're talking good examples are novels and movies. If they are identical, this is what we began with, which is perfect competition. So wheat and milk and things like that. So again, just to kind of recap before we really launch into this, monopolistic competition is going to be characterized by many firms, not as many as perfect competition. We're not talking thousands and thousands and thousands, but dozens, and up to that, up to maybe 100 or so. Many firms selling products that are similar but not identical. Similar but not identical. So that's what a monopolistic competitive market is. So let's begin. A couple things for you as we launch. Some features that are similar to monopolies, and it also has some features that are going to be similar to perfect competition. So I've said that before. What does that mean? Here are three of them for you, and I would have these in your notes. I would make sure you know these. The attributes of a monopolistic competition market structure is that, number one, there are many sellers. Okay. Number two, there's product differentiation. And then number three, and this one is key, this one's very important, this will be different, this will separate it from monopoly and it will separate it from an oligopoly. This will make it more like a perfect competition market structure, is that there is free entry and exit. So I'm going to stop there already. I want you to consider, ask yourself this question. If there is free entry and exit, what does that probably tell us about the long run? What does that probably tell us about monopolistic competition in the long run? We'll get to that in a moment. Many sellers. Let's unpack each of them quick. Many sellers. In a monopolistic competitive market, there are many firms competing for, and this is the key part, they are competing for the same group of customers. And we'll get to that in our second video of monopolistic competition of why that's so important. But they are competing for the same group of customers. So, a couple examples for you. Books. Okay. The biography of Abraham Lincoln and Harry Potter are clearly very different books. I think we can all agree, right? It's a differentiated product. Those are not the same book. That being said, they are still books, right? They're still technically the same product, even though they're differentiated, they're still the same. Okay, CDs, if you think about, or just music or albums, right? Beyonce and Beethoven's symphonies are different musical choices. Okay, they are, however, both musical albums. You think about movies, video games, restaurants, piano lessons even. Right? In a piano lesson, you could have the same product. You are learning the piano, but clearly anybody who's had piano lessons knows that the instructor and the books that you use are different and the methods are different. Cookies, furniture. Hopefully you understand what I'm getting here. Product differentiation. So just like we talked about with books and movies and such, each firm in a monopolistically competitive market produces a product that is at least slightly different from other firms. Rather than being a price taker, as would be the case in a perfectly competitive market structure, each firm faces a downward sloping demand curve. Okay? Think to yourself really quick, perfectly competitive firms, the first market structure we looked at in this unit, what type of demand curve do they have? Hopefully you remember the answer, of course, is a perfectly elastic demand curve, horizontal. For this will function more like a monopoly, a downward sloping demand curve. And why is that? It's because of free entry and exit. Firms can enter or exit the market without restrictions. And what I alluded to earlier when I asked you what can we infer about the fact that it's free entry and exit, the answer is right there in that third bullet point, and I would maybe make sure that that especially is written down and you know this one. The number of firms in this type of market, in a monopolistically competitive market, will adjust until economic profits are zero, which we also call normal profits. So firms will enter and exit. They will come and go until economic profit is zero. That is important. We'll look here in a moment. We're going to look at the graphs of how we know that. Monopolistically competitive firms differentiate themselves or are different when you analyze the short run versus the long run. So I'm going to start with the short run. We'll look at that. We'll look at the graph of the short run, and then we will talk about the long run and we'll graph that out as well. So in the short run, economic profits are going to encourage new forms to enter the market. Okay, so first things first, look at that first little notation that's made there. In the short run, economic profits can exist. So, firms can make profits in the short run in a monopolistically competitive market. When that happens, just like with perfect competition, you will see a flood of firms in this industry. Okay, so like sharks drawn to blood in the water, I think was the analogy we talked about earlier. Increasing the number of products offered. I'll give you a great example. Think about the superhero movies, okay? The Avenger movies, the Marvel movies, whatever. When Iron Man first came out, all of a sudden we saw this flood of other superhero shows, movies, books, comics, everything, because there was profit to be had. And so the market got flooded with people offering similar, not identical, similar products. So this is going to reduce the demand faced by firms already partaking in this market. We'll look at that here in a little bit. Incumbent firm demand curves are going to shift to the left, and the demand for incumbent firms' products will fall and their profits decline as firms join the industry. So we're going to graph a monopolistically competitive market in the short run. This may be worth having in your notes. It's helpful. I want to point out, first of all, you can see the title here. This is a firm that is going to be making a profit. And again, yes, they can have profits in the short run. So we start out with an average total cost curve. It's our typical U shape as we've seen before. And remember that in a monopolistically competitive market, they face a downward sloping demand curve. And then we have a marginal cost curve. And you'll notice that marginal cost curve crosses that ATC at the same location as the bottom of the ATC curve. And then we have our marginal revenue curve. Okay, so you've got both demand and you have marginal revenue. And just as we always do, how do we begin, right? How do we find, there's a lot happening on this graph, so where do we know the quantity is going to be with this firm? Where is profit maximized? The answer is where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So we start here, and then we elevate her up and down, right? We have our average total costs, and then we go all the way up to price at the demand curve. So ladies and gentlemen, what is this shaded box going to be? Well, this is going to be the profit. Now ask yourself this question. I want you to look hard at this graph. Ask yourself this. Is this graph any different than a monopoly graph? Is this any different than what a monopoly graph looks like? The answer is no. This is fully what a monopoly graph looks like. There's a markup of price, there's excess capacity, there's deadweight loss, everything like that. And this is the point I'm trying to get at. When firms are operating in a monopolistically competitive market in the short run, they can have profit just like a monopoly. What we will see, though, is that over time, firms will enter and exit, and that's going to change our outcome. That's what's going to make this different than a monopoly. So in the short run, firms will exit the market if there are losses. Okay, if there are losses, firms will exit the market. This will decrease the number of products offered. This will increase the demand faced by remaining firms, and it will shift the remaining firms' demand curves to the right. Okay, this will shift the remaining demand curves to the right. This will increase the remaining firms' profits. Let's do a graph to show you what I'm talking about. I may have this one in your notes as well. So notice, once again, this is short run. All right, this is a short run graph, but look at the title. This is a firm that is making a loss. All right, this is making a loss. Let's graph it out quick. Average total cost, marginal cost crossing at its efficient scale. We have a marginal revenue curve, and we have a demand curve. All right. Right away, notice what happened here. This will look different than a monopoly. We don't usually see this in a monopoly structure. You have MC equals MR, where that black dot is, and the price that they're going to charge is up at the demand curve. Okay, because that's what people are willing and able to pay for this product. However, what do you notice happened here? Their total cost curve is above the demand curve. What do we know happens when average total cost is above our revenue? That is going to be a loss. Okay, that's going to be a loss. Here's the example we'll be using as we move forward. Think about going to the movie theater. Think about a movie that comes out and totally just falls on its face in the box office. It does not do well. All right, maybe not as well as expected. Maybe it was a high budget film. Maybe its average total cost was really, really high. Maybe it was a superhero movie that looked like it was going to be this big success, and then it just did not do well in the box office. What happens to movies that don't make a lot of revenue when they come out? What happens to movies in the theater? Well, they quickly get pulled, right? Movie theaters only have so many screens, and if a film is not doing well, all of a sudden it's like, wow, that was in the movie theater for about 2 weeks and now it's gone. All right? That's because firms will enter and exit the market until we have an equilibrium. So if we look at this example right here, let's say this is a movie that was in the theater and its costs were higher than the revenue it brought in, what will happen? Well, what we're going to see happen is it's going to drive us to a long-run equilibrium. Firms will enter and exit until they are making exactly zero economic profit. Please remember that. Put a star next to that. Memorize that. This is going to be just like a perfect competition in that we have zero economic profit. Let's see why. You have a marginal revenue curve. We have our marginal cost curve. We know that MC equals MR is the profit maximization. We have a demand curve. And ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to make sure you absolutely write this in your notes. This is the graph. If I had to make a wager of what will be on the AP test, it's this one. This is a monopolistically competitive market structure in the long run. And what do you notice happened here? It's kind of a funky mixture of perfect competition and monopoly. You have our average total cost curve above our marginal cost for the most part, and you can see that it becomes tangent. It becomes tangent to the price that is being charged. So there's a whole lot happening here that we can analyze. First of all, what do we know about the profit, loss, or normal profit of this firm? Well, it's not making any additional profit, but it's certainly not having a loss. So in other words, it is facing normal profit or zero economic profit. However, what makes this different than perfectly competitive, everyone? Think about that. What makes this different than a perfectly competitive market structure? The answer is the price. Look at the price. It's marked up just like in a monopoly. It's marked up higher than what is efficient or what the firm could do if it was in a perfectly competitive market structure. So what really is occurring here is that we have a higher price and the firm is earning normal profit. This tangency lies vertically above the intersection of MC equals MR. So two quick characteristics about that. As in a monopoly, price exceeds marginal cost. So the profit maximizing requires marginal revenue to equal marginal cost. We've talked about that many, many times. The downward sloping demand curve makes marginal revenue less than the price, just like in a monopoly. However, as in a competitive market, price equals ATC. So you have free entry and exit that's going to drive economic profit to zero. So you have two forces of two different concepts we've learned about happening at the same time. So you have monopoly characteristics and you have competitive market characteristics. Two noteworthy differences between monopolistic and perfect competition. There's a lot of similarities, but two big differences, and these are very important. Number one, there is excess capacity. Just like in a monopoly, there's excess capacity, and I'll show you what that looks like on a graph here in a moment. And we have markup over our marginal cost, which again, we will look at in a moment. Markup over marginal cost. So the two big differences, excess capacity, markup over marginal cost. Let's look at what that looks like on a graph here in a second. To break them down a little further, when I'm saying excess capacity, what am I really meaning? I mean that there is no excess capacity in a perfectly competitive firm in the long run. In other words, they're producing exactly what is most profit maximizing efficient for them. And that free entry results in competitive firms producing the point where ATC is minimized. This is where the efficient scale to the firm exists. This should not be new to you. This is all review. This is stuff that we talked about when we did perfect competition structures. All right? So there's no excess capacities in perfect competition, and free entry and exit drives everything to being at its efficient scale. That part will not be true with a monopolistic competition market structure, and let's see why. It's because there is excess capacity in the long run. That's key. Look at that, in the long run. There's excess capacity in monopolistic competition in the long run. And in monopolistic competition, output is less than the efficient scale of what would happen in perfect competition. Let's take a look at the graph so we see what I'm talking about. On the left-hand side here, we have monopolistically competitive firm. On the right-hand side, we have a perfectly competitive firm. So we have our ATC, our marginal revenue. MC, we have where MC equals MR, we can already see that. Really quickly, I want to remind you to a concept we've talked about before. In the long run, we can look at what we call firms' economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. And if you look at ATC, when it is sloping downwards, as quantity goes up, if ATC is decreasing, we call that its economies of scale. And then once it starts increasing as quantity goes up, that is called its diseconomies of scale. Right smack dab in the middle is the efficient scale. That is, if the firm produced that quantity, it is fully efficiently maximizing its resources and money. Okay, its efficient scale is there. Aha! With monopolistically competitive, just like a monopoly, they don't produce that quantity, do they? Is the quantity that they produce higher or lower than what would be efficient? And tell me about price. Is price higher or lower than what would be socially efficient? Well, let's look at perfect competition. MC, ATC, what do we know about the demand curve for a perfectly competitive market? Before I add it, think to yourself, what should that perfectly competitive market look like? It looks like a perfectly elastic demand curve. And notice that the quantity that is produced is equal to the efficient scale. It's equal to the efficient scale. Look at the difference between those two graphs. Remember those, all right? Look at those. The second characteristic I want to talk about is the markup over marginal cost. For a competitive firm, price equals marginal cost. Okay, price equals marginal cost. For a monopolistically competitive firm, price is going to be higher than a marginal cost. What does that sound like? That sounds like a monopoly to me. And so, because price exceeds MC, an extra unit sold at that posted price means that the profit exists for a monopolistically competitive firm. Let's talk about that. Look at the graphs again. These are the same ones we just did a moment ago. On the left-hand side is monopolistically competitive. On the right-hand side is perfectly competitive. Look at the price. In a monopolistically competitive market, if you take where MC equals MR and you elevate her up to the demand, which is how you can find your price, you can see that there is a markup in price. In other words, the price of that commodity is higher than where MC equals MR. Look at over on the perfectly competitive. Okay? You can see that, once again, the quantity produced is the efficient scale, and the price doesn't change. Now, if we look back at graph A, you can see the efficient scale versus the quantity produced, there is excess capacity. So that's the problems that exist here with a monopolistically competitive market, is you have higher pricing and you have lower output from what would be efficient. Neither of those things exist when it comes to perfectly competitive firms. So monopolistically competitive firms do not have the desirable properties that a perfectly competitive one does. There is normal deadweight loss that exists for monopoly pricing. Okay, so just like with a monopoly, we have that problem, right? We have transactions that could and would and should have occurred that can't because of this markup in price and this excess capacity. However, you have to ask yourself, why doesn't the government regulate this? Right? The reality is there is a massive, what we call administrative burden of trying to regulate the pricing of all these firms. Think about that for a moment. All right, think about that. If you tried to regulate every movie, book, musical album, everything that came out and that has some form of monopolistic power, it would be fully overwhelmed and your economy would collapse. So you have to internalize it in some regard, right? Firms that are producing differentiated products have to be able to have that market power. So as we get close to wrapping it up here, another way in which monopolistic competition may be socially inefficient is that the number of firms in that market may not be the ideal amount. There may be too much or too little. There may simply be too many restaurants in one town, or there might be too few. There may be simply too many movies of the same genre in the movie theater, or there could be too few. So you might not have that ideal perfect amount. And the externalities that exist with this problem is that you have product variety. And remember, what is an externality again? An externality is an effect on a bystander, so people that are not necessarily partaking in this market structure. So you've got product variety. So because consumers get some consumer surplus from the introduction of a new product, entry of new firms conveys a positive externality to consumers. New movies, right? New books, new musical albums. It all feels and looks like a positive externality, right? This is good for the consumers. And there's also a business dealing externality. Because other firms lose customers and profits from the entry of a new competitor, entry of that new firm imposes a negative externality on existing firms. If I make a movie and it goes to the movie theater, I am stealing customers from other films that are in that movie theater, right? If I open a restaurant in my town, the demand for the other restaurants will go down because those consumers I am now trying to get to come to my restaurant. So that's a negative externality.